Hello, today I'm here to talk about The Power by Naomi Alderman. This came out last year, and this year it was awarded the Bailey's Women's Prize for Fiction because it's very good. This takes place in the present day, and it is where women realise they have the power to electrocute people through their fingers. I think it's mentioned at some point that it might be like a fall off from like nuclear stuff from world wars, but it's also something that's mentioned as being something that may have existed in the past and been kind of bred out of people, but now it's back and it's like a skein under the collarbone. At the start only kind of teenage girls have it, but they have the ability to awaken it in older women, and there are a few men that have it, but it's like a really uncommon thing. The story follows four quite different main characters, and they kind of interweave throughout the text. So we have Roxy, who at the start is 14 years old. She is the daughter of a British mobster, the Monk family, and it starts with her seeing her mum get murdered. She has one of the most powerful skeins in the world, and a lot of her storyline follows her crime family, really. Next we have Tunde, who is a man, the only male character we get the perspective from, who is from Nigeria, and he cottons on pretty quickly that this is going to be a really big deal, and basically becomes a journalist, like ad hoc, like buys loads of cameras and then just flies to places and gets footage from on the ground. Then we have Margot, who is a mayor of a city in the US, I think it's Detroit. Anyway, so she's like a power-hungry politician, not like power-hungry, she's still a good woman, and we see her as she kind of like goes through the ranks of the US political system, but also her daughter Jocelyn, one of her daughters, has some issues with her skein, and we follow her quite closely as well. Finally we have Ali, who's in her mid-teens when the story starts. She's been in foster care most of her life because her parents aren't around anymore, and she ends up with this very abusive family and leaves them in quite a dramatic fashion, and names herself Evie and joins a convent. She notices very early on that her powers are really sensitive, and she can use them in ways that people don't think are natural, and she also has a voice in her head, and she becomes like kind of the second coming of Christ, sort of. I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. Overall, I thought this was a really fantastic book. It was great because you got to see like the scope of the whole world, but also the scope of these individual people. So you see how these issues are pervasive in families, but also you see like women taking over Saudi Arabia, and then you see like a political coup in Moldova that splits the country in two, and then one of them becomes the opposite of the current regime in Saudi Arabia, where suddenly like men aren't allowed to drive. It was really fun and exciting, and I think the image that these kind of lightning bolt scars create of these kind of tree-like structures over the body is really evocative, and it managed to toe the line between being very kind of like speculative science fiction but also being very contemporary. I think it did that really well. The start of the book says 10 years to go, and the book spans those 10 years, so it's counting down to something, and you don't really know what it is. If you thought really hard at the start, you would know what it is, but I was pretty blind until the last few pages, really. I didn't really like the end. It didn't land for me very well, and I read this a couple weeks ago, and just going through it now again to refresh my memory, just the whole kind of like basis of the way it's structured, I don't really enjoy. Overall though, I would highly recommend. And now I'm going to talk about several things. I'm going to talk about the deity in this one character. I'm going to talk about feminism, obviously, and I'm also going to talk a bit about kind of like that whole structural thing that I didn't really like about it. So I think the rest of this video will get progressively more spoilery, but nothing like that would actually hurt your enjoyment of the book. Okay, so Eve, Mother Eve, she named herself after the first woman, and it's very strange because from your perspective, you meet this girl, Ali, who is this teenager, and she, you know, runs away from home, renames herself. You can tell already that she's very manipulative and very cunning, but she also literally has this voice that she hears in her head, and it's never really explicitly said who that is. Like at a certain point she thinks it's her mum and is like, "Mum," and the voice is like, "Sure," and the voice talks in like a very kind of doting, mothering kind of way, but she does use it to guide her a lot. And in the book it kind of does feel like you're supposed to think that this is the voice of God, but it also like could be the voice of a schizophrenic maniac. There is literally a passage in the book where she is faith healing. Literally, she has this following, this big church, she's got the Book of Eve, and she heals people on stage, and then afterwards, well, she heals her with her electric powers by just like hitting the right muscles and stuff. And in the same way all faith healing works, she's like, it may last, probably won't. It's so manipulative in the way that like deities probably shouldn't be, and you're never really told like what her game plan is, like what's her end game in becoming this figurehead. I just didn't trust her at all. But I think it's also an interesting comment on you know, even if you've had a special power, as she does above other people's powers, that you can manipulate it into making people perceive you as literally godly. And it kind of made me think that the book was putting forth a kind of anti-religious stance, because you could see what a sham it was behind this character who was this figurehead. If you compared Evie to Jesus, it would still be like, yes, they have a special power, but the way she uses it to accrue this following is really quite disturbing. I thought that was a very interesting thing the book touched on. Now I'm going to talk about the portrayal of men in this book. Oh, that's never something I get to say. It's ridiculous, because every man in this book is super indignant. Like, they genuinely believe within them that like the natural order of things is for men to be more powerful. We only get the actual perspective of one male character, which is Tunde, and I don't think that he is an ally, but I just think he's a vehicle to like show the world, and you never really get his personal opinion on these things. But any other male input, be it newscasters or like there's a fucking men's rights activist group, are just so fucking like, it makes me really, really angry. Tunde tries to imagine what it would be like to have one, a power you can't give away or trade. He feels himself yearning for it, repulsed by it. He reads online forums where men say that if all the men in the world had one, everything would be back to the way it ought to be. It makes me really angry, and I'm kind of sad that there wasn't a character in this book that was a proper like ally to women, in being like, I am a man and I know that the power imbalance here is wrong. We didn't have that, and I know that's the point, is that she's trying to put forth that there aren't actually many of those people in the world. Definitely not as many as there should be, which is 100%. It riled me up really, really easily, and just makes me think about all of the like gender inequality in the world, and it's ugh. So I guess it did its job. I was thinking the other day about a podcast called The Guilty Feminist, which is a great podcast hosted by Deborah Frances White, and I was thinking about one of the very early episodes. I think it's like the 3rd episode, and it's about apologising and saying sorry, and I'll link it down below. And it was the first time I kind of listened to something, and more so than just understanding that men and women kind of have different roles that they portray in society and shit like that, and have gender gaps and crap like that. But this episode on apologising made me realise how pervasive our internalised sexism is. I've encouraged a few of my male friends to listen to this podcast, and they really liked it. And someone in particular said that episode blew them away, because they didn't realise how kind of inbuilt that stuff is. So the episode was about saying sorry and the way that women kind of communicate what they want or expect from somebody. So if I was sending someone an email being like, oh, if you wouldn't mind, could you please take a look at this, like, don't worry if you don't have time, or something like that, and men just, you know, ask for what they want. And it's so true, because if you walk around and just listen to how many times women say sorry compared to men, it is like ridiculous. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to talk about is the very start and end of this book. So it's not actually entirely narrative. It starts off with a few letters and ends with a few letters. And it's basically this man called Neil who is writing to his friend Naomi about this book that he's written, and he says like, oh, it's not going to be one of those boring historical things, but this is how the historians think that stuff happened, but I'm going to kind of like fictionalize it to make you know, a more interesting novel. Those letters take place in a time where women are the more dominant sex, and it's like been forgotten what it's like to have men the more dominant sex. It's quite fun to have this at the start before you even get into the story, because you can kind of like see the other side before it ever even gets near to there. I see you've included some scenes with male soldiers, male police officers, and boy crime gangs. But this is a bit I think is important. I think I'd rather enjoy this world run by men you've been talking about. Surely a kinder, more caring, and, dare I say it, more sexy world than the one we live in. That means a lot, because it's basically her saying that that as a world run by women, they think that the other way around would probably be nicer. Like kinder is a word that you'd only ever think about being used for, in groups of women rather than a group of men. And I think what's being put forth in this is it's not that, it's it's like the weaker side is perceived to be more kind. It's not women, because women in this book are portrayed, being quite violent, because they suddenly have this ability to actually fight. And that was quite an interesting takeaway, because I don't really think of that as being feminist. It's most certainly egalitarian, but it's actually not being like women are the fairer sex and are stronger and more powerful and more intelligent and stuff like that. It's just actually being like, whoever is in power will seem like the brutes. So there are also these letters at the end where Naomi has finished reading this book that Neil has written, and her kind of commenting on like accuracies and stuff like that. And the very last line, Neil, I know this might be very distasteful to you, but have you considered publishing this book under a woman's name? Best love, Naomi. I love that that is at the end, because it just like punches into you how totally far away from that realm we are in, where like being published under a man's name, or at least an androgynous name, is still like very widely practiced, and the reverse, as far as I know, is not, or if it is, barely is. Reading that line makes it sound so absurd, and the extremity of that absurdity is like the distance from a world where men are dominant and then a world where women are dominant, and the middle point where I think we're trying to aim for is still a really large gap. Okay, so that is my video on The Power by Naomi Alderman. I have a lot of feelings. I hope you've enjoyed it. Let me know if you read this book, what you liked about it, and then also, as usual, if you want to read it, if you don't want to read it, let me know. And I will see you soon for another video.